Well, I want to warn you and perhaps apologize for the fact that you're now going to be hearing from a philosopher. And, we've got to just hope that Carl knew what he was doing, inviting a philosopher to come and speak at this conference. He's made that mistake now 10 years in a row. This morning my presentation is on the subject, Is God Necessary for Morality? But I wanted to warn you about that because this is a fairly technical presentation. There are going to be some things about this presentation that will probably be new to you, and I'm going to be using some new terminology, some unfamiliar terminology that I hope I can explain and make clear. But let me give you two bits of advice. Much of what we learn through the things that we read. And so these are two corollaries for reading. The universal law of reading has these two corollaries, and it translates to what we learn through what we hear as well. The first corollary is to read effectively, always sit in a canoe and wear a face mask, snorkel, and flippers. The second corollary is don't believe everything you read or hear. So go ahead, get your face mask, snorkel, and flippers out, and join me as we talk about a fairly technical topic, the relationship between God and morality. And I'm using an iPad for the first time as part of the presentation. You're not seeing what I'm doing here. I'm doing this for my benefit, and I'm punching this button. I just want you to know how this works, okay? This is what's really going on here. This is why I'm as confused as anybody else could be during this morning session. I'm using my iPad to advance my slides, but they're not advancing on the screen. I'm pushing a button here to make sure that they advance them at the right time. And by the way, we should keep in mind the wonderful work that our tech people are doing, and we'll thank you all for doing that. I want to give you several moral arguments for the existence of God, or for theism. And I'll begin by giving you two of them, two initially. Then I'll have some things to say about God and morality that's more general. And then I'll come back and talk about some other indicators of the existence of God through moral experience. Now, the first argument I want to give, you might call making sense of moral facts. This is an argument that takes the fact that there are moral truths and tries to make sense of them, to explain them in terms of the existence of God. This is a fairly familiar argument in my field. A lot of philosophers talk about this argument, and it is often used in public debates on the question, does God exist? And I want you to know about this argument, even though it is the second argument that I will be emphasizing. And it's one that I like much better in certain ways. It's concerned with making the connection between moral facts and moral agents, human beings who act in a morally responsible way. Let's look first then at the first of these arguments, making sense of moral facts. Now on the screen you'll see an enumeration of propositions that doesn't quite give us the argument in its strict logical form. What I'm doing is I'm just showing you the progression of the thought from the beginning of the argument to the conclusion, and I'll comment as I go. I'm doing it this way because typically in conversation with other people, we don't just give them numbered premises in a conclusion like we do a syllogism. We have a conversation. And so I'm going to talk you through these propositions and try to help you see how it is that moral facts give us some reason to think that God exists. And the first proposition is that there are objective moral facts. Now, let's be clear about what a moral fact is supposed to be. A moral fact can be some specific fact about morality. It could be a specific fact about a moral action. Or it could be a specific fact about a person's moral character. So let's take an action, for example. It is a moral fact that rape and murder are wrong. They're not just illegal, they are morally wrong. Those are two different things. One reason for the law against these things is because they are immoral. Now, we do have laws that prohibit certain actions that are not themselves intrinsically wrong. They're not intrinsically morally wrong. For example, we have stop signs in the city that determine the flow of traffic, so that when you come to a stop sign, you're supposed to stop. Now in California, we have a California stop, which means you just sort of roll slowly through the stop, like this, hoping you don't get hit. Unless you're riding a motorcycle. You don't want to do that on a motorcycle. But the stop sign tells us that we're supposed to stop. That's the law. And if a police officer driving and sees us go through a stop sign, we will get pulled over. He will pull us over and write us a ticket because we have broken the law. But that's not a law because somebody realized that when, for whatever reason, there are these red signs with the word stop on them, it's morally wrong if you keep going. No, it's because of the practical necessity to keep control of traffic so that at intersections we don't have jams and accidents and terrible things happen. And so there's nothing morally wrong in itself about continuing to drive through an intersection unless you put people at risk. And so we have a law that helps us avoid that, helps to prevent that from happening. So that's a case of a law that does not parallel a moral truth or a moral fact. But other laws do, and they are laws because of that, such as the law against murder in cold blood or the rape of an individual. And there are many laws of this sort. There are also moral facts that are not prohibited by law. It is morally wrong to tell a lie in most circumstances. Now, we have laws about lying under some circumstances. So, for example, maybe you filed your tax return recently and you wrote down a figure for your adjusted gross income. That's the basis for the taxation of your income for the year 2011. And if you don't write down the correct information and you fudge the numbers and you deliberately deceive the IRS, that is telling a lie. And there's a law against that, and there are strict penalties, very severe penalties if you get caught. Right? So that is a law that correlates with the immorality of lying. But not all lying correlates with some legal prohibition. When you have problems telling the truth at work, or with a neighbor, or with maybe somebody else, maybe one of your children, right, fudges the truth, that's a euphemism for lying, all right? You don't take them to court. You don't say, hey, I asked you if you had 2 cookies instead of 1, and you said 1. But I see it was 2, wasn't it? Yes, it was 2. I'm sorry, I lied. Well, I'm sorry I have to take you to court. There's a law against that. You don't do that. So the relationship between law and morality is kind of complicated, but the real consideration here is the nature of a moral fact, whether or not it correlates with a law of the land. And what I'm saying here is that there are such things as moral facts. And they can be facts about actions. It's morally wrong to tell a lie. It's just one example. There are also moral principles that govern or help us understand in concrete situations what is the right thing or the wrong thing to do. So we need moral principles that tell us when killing a human being counts as murder and when it doesn't, if there are cases when it doesn't. So, for example, if you kill an enemy on the battlefield, does that count as murder? And if so, it would be morally wrong, because we've stipulated that murder, under any circumstances, is morally wrong. So we need principles that would help us distinguish between acts that fall under a certain description, like killing a human being, that are morally wrong, and acts that fall under the same description that are not morally wrong. Maybe capital punishment is another example. Now, I'm not here to argue about that. I'm not here to talk about whether there are cases where it's morally permissible to kill another human being, either whether it's capital punishment or on the battlefield or some other situation. I'm just saying that we need moral principles if we're going to make a distinction. And those moral principles would also count as moral facts. You understand? Now, these moral facts are objective. What does that mean? To call these moral facts objective is just to say that they are what they are, independent of what we think or how we feel, either as individuals or collectively as groups of people or as a society. In other words, they are not subjective moral facts. They aren't made to be the facts they are by the feelings or thoughts that we have. They're true in and of themselves, whether we agree with them or not. They're facts of an objective sort. So it's easy to understand what we mean by subjective and understand objective in contrast to that. So an objective moral fact is a moral fact that is factually the case, independently of our view or feeling about the fact. So, it is a moral fact that what the Nazis did to the Jews during the Third Reich in Germany is morally wrong. And you might agree with that. But your agreement has nothing to do with whether it's right or wrong. There are people, the Nazis themselves, who apparently did not agree with that, did not believe that. They might have thought that what they were doing was morally honorable rather than morally objectionable. Well, they were wrong. But you see, if moral facts were subjective, that would be relative to the class of individuals engaged in the action, and they could justify their actions by believing that what they were doing was the right thing to do. That's a subjective conception of moral facts, and that is a misunderstanding of morality. Okay? So there are objective moral facts. We understand that there are these facts. We understand something about what they are, their principles, their character traits, and they are actions of various sorts, or the characteristics of various actions, and they are objective rather than subjective. Now then, the second proposition is that objective moral facts are either natural or they are non-natural. This is true about any fact. Any state of affairs, any object is either a natural object or a non-natural object. For something to be a natural object is for it to be something that can be understood or explained, even discovered through empirical methodologies, like we see in the practice of science. So, in doing chemistry and biology, geology, even human psychology, there are various facts that we can discover and that we can understand and that we can relate to each other. We can build a whole science of the phenomenal world of physics and chemistry and biology and human psychology, just observing these natural facts. And the laws of nature relate to these natural facts. Now, in many cases, these are just physical facts. So, the laws of nature govern the behavior. We say govern the behavior. They reflect regularities, really, in the behavior of physical objects in the universe at a grand scale concerning galaxies and planets and systems like the solar system, right on down to the very small things that we can't even see with the naked eye, having to do with molecules, atoms, electrons, things that are unobservable like black holes and things like that, that we come to believe exist and are real through observational experience and inference. And we consider these to be natural facts because they are capable. We can discover them and think about them, in some cases even observe them by this empirical means. Non-natural facts are not subject to that kind of empirical discovery, observation, or manipulation. They're just not of that sort. Now, objective moral facts are pretty clearly not natural facts. They're not discoverable using our empirical faculties. You can't see them, you can't taste them, you never hear them, they don't rumble, they don't go bang in the night or bump in the night. They don't have a distinct odor, right? And there's nothing that would be empirical that would establish the existence and characteristics of a particular moral fact. You cannot get knowledge of a moral fact that way. So they're not discovered that way, and they aren't of that sort, and they can't be manipulated like you might manipulate objects in the physical world. And so they are non-natural facts. That's the third proposition here because it's a consequence of what I'm saying. Objective moral facts are not natural. So they are non-natural. You might say, well, what's the difference between 3 and 4? Well, proposition 2 just says that facts are either natural or non-natural, and 3 says they are not one of those things, namely natural, so they have to be the other thing. And that's what proposition 4 says. The other thing is they are non-natural. So they are non-natural facts. Now, non-natural facts are peculiar things. They're very odd. And you still want to explain them. When you discover some physical object you've never encountered before, you go to work using the method of science, really, to understand it, to try to explain what it is, to describe it, and make sense of why it exists, or why it is happening, why this event is occurring, or this object came into existence, or some change in the environment occurred. So you look for an explanation. Well, it's just as appropriate to look for an explanation of non-natural facts as it is to look for an explanation for natural facts. But you can't give the same kind of explanation for both kinds of facts. So you can't explain non-natural facts the way you might explain natural facts. You can't really do it empirically or scientifically. So what is the explanation for the non-natural character of moral facts that objectively exist? And it's very hard for a naturalist to make sense of that. And so many theists have argued that the best way to account for the existence and objectivity of non-natural moral facts is that God exists as the standard of moral perfection. And that these natural facts are what they are in relationship to the intrinsic goodness and character of God. That nothing that's in the natural world can emulate. Right? So non-natural moral facts don't get their moral quality and their moral distinctiveness from any relation they bear to the physical world. It must be in relation to something else, and that something else is this personal being who is morally perfect, intrinsically good, and absolutely so. And you could make sense not only of their being facts, because they are tied to the nature of God, who exists on this account, but also you could explain their objectivity, because they are not subject to the whims of human beings, either individually or in society. Now that is one kind of argument from moral facts to the existence of God. Now, one problem with this kind of argument is that there are naturalists who agree that there are moral facts, objective moral facts, and that in a sense they're non-natural. So these are naturalists of a certain sort. They're naturalists who deny that God exists, and they believe that everything in the physical world can be explained in a purely naturalistic way, contrary, for example, to the design inference to the existence of God to explain complexity in the physical world. But they do allow for the existence of non-natural facts, because by that they simply mean that they're facts of a different sort than these physical facts. And they include objective moral facts. And so they say that these objective moral facts just stand on their own, and they are what they call brute facts. They aren't explained in terms of anything else independent of themselves. Nothing external to a moral fact explains the existence and characteristics of a moral fact. So you don't need God to explain them. They just exist. They just are what they are. That's the end of the story. So if you're talking to a naturalist who believes something like that, you might have a difficult time explaining to them why they need God to ground the reality of these moral facts. And so, if they don't see the point, and sometimes that's what it comes to, is that you think the inference makes sense, and it's a better way to explain the existence of these moral facts, but somebody else doesn't see it that way. They can't make that inference or feel the necessity to do so. I want to say all is not lost. There is another very good argument that circumvents that problem, and that brings us to the next argument. Making connections between moral facts and moral agents. Moral facts, I've said, are objective. They are non-natural. Now I'm going to use some different language to talk about moral facts. Moral facts are abstract objects. Now this is a philosophical term. I'm using this language philosophically. There may be other ways that you use the terminology when you use the word abstract. Right? You might think about abstract art, for example. But abstract art still is physical. It's something you can perceive with your senses. It might be musical, it might be sculpture, it might be a painting. But what's abstract about it has to do with how it relates to reality. And it's not realistic in the way that, well, realistic art is. That's not how I'm using the word abstract here. I'm using the word abstract in a very sort of philosophically peculiar way. And I need to try to explain this. Abstract objects have various features. So, for example, an abstract object is an immaterial object. It's not physical. So it doesn't take up space. You can't see it. You don't carry them around in your pocket. Right? You don't see them crossing the street. Abstract objects are not of that sort. Now, concrete objects are. You might have keys in your pocket. You might see people walking across the street. Those are concrete objects. Abstract objects don't behave that way because they aren't that kind of thing. They're immaterial objects. Another thing about abstract objects is that they are timeless. They're not part of the warp and woof of the physical universe, and so they exist, if they exist at all, independently of that physics and that physical context. It's very important to understand this as well about abstract objects. They have no causal powers. They are, we say, causally inert. They can't do things. They can't make things happen. This doesn't mean that they're not meaningful, but you're starting to wonder what's the point in talking about abstract objects. They're invisible, they're immaterial, they're timeless, and they don't do anything. So who cares about abstract facts? Who cares about abstract objects? Well, abstract objects, it turns out, are very important. Now, you remember last night, if you were here last night, during, shall we say, Randy's very stimulating presentation on the complexity of the reproductive process and how that constitutes evidence for a designer, that he had some really impressive line drawings of the appropriate objects. Well, here is last night I stayed up late thinking about how I'm going to present a line drawing for an abstract object. And after giving this quite a bit of thought and trying different things and experimenting so that I could do as well as Randy, at least on this one point, and give you just one slide with at least one line drawing that reflects what I'm talking about, I thought of this. So here is what an abstract object looks like. That's my line drawing of an abstract object. Now, moral facts are facts of this sort. They are abstract objects. Moral agents, human beings like you and me, are concrete objects. And we are familiar, very familiar with the notion of concreteness. Right? I have some glasses up here. This is a concrete object. I have a body, that's a concrete object. I'm looking at some pages here in front of me. Concrete object. We've got concrete objects in this room, which is itself a concrete object. We know about the properties that these concrete objects have. In contrast to that, there are these abstract objects, and moral facts are among the abstract objects that exist. There are other abstract objects. For example, if numbers exist, they are abstract objects. Now, numerals are not. Numerals are concrete objects because they're physical facts, right? They're representations, actually, of numbers. A numeral and a number, not the same thing. You can see numerals, you can't see numbers. So when you get your calculator out and you start punching, figures in there, what you see are not numbers, what you see are numerals. And they are physical representations in concrete form of abstract objects, namely numerals. You can't see numerals. Now there's a philosophical dispute about whether numerals exist. Number. You can't see numbers. And there's a philosophical dispute about whether numbers exist. So some are realists about numbers and some are anti-realists about numbers. And I'm not interested in that debate for the time being. But if they exist, then they are abstract objects. That's another example. Now we know that moral facts are real. So their reality is not in dispute. The question is, what kind of reality do they have? And they are abstract objects. If anything, they're abstract objects. They're not concrete. Moral agents, however, are physical and concrete objects. We are concrete objects. Now, Randy was speaking last night about the reproductive system, organs in the human body that can explain how conception happens and birth. He was talking about concrete facts, concrete objects. And he was saying that it makes sense to explain the complexity of these concrete objects in terms of the existence of a designer who intended for them to be the way they are. Because that would explain how things happen against the odds. Much better than an evolutionary process. That was a very good presentation. The difference between his presentation and mine is that I'm going to make an argument from abstract objects to the existence of God. But it's somewhat like that. And here's the issue. You and I, let's suppose, evolved, okay, on a naturalistic evolutionary picture. We just showed up because of natural processes that were unguided by any kind of divine personality. That's the theory. And yet, here we are as moral agents. We're not just physical organisms capable of reproduction, so that others like us can also exist, and our species can continue. That's all very interesting and in itself very odd, and it's very complex. But there's another dimension to human reality and human nature and human experience that's not captured by any of that concrete stuff or any of the physics or any of the biology. And it has to do with morality. It has to do with the fact that among physical objects, we are unique in being moral agents. So yes, we have impressive physical capacities, among which are these reproductive options. But beyond the physical, we are also moral agents. And moral agents are being created in the womb. Not just physical organisms that will have a life of their own when they're born. No, they are moral agents as well. That's what we are. Now that needs to be explained. And you might ask the evolutionary naturalist, so how do you explain the fact that we are moral agents when other physical objects are not? What's unique and what explains what makes us different from all the non-moral objects in the world? Inanimate objects like boulders, right? You could be crushed by a boulder, but not be justified in blaming the boulder. You know, say, okay, you're going to court. You know, you almost killed me. Boulder's pretty indifferent about things like that. Or you get run over by a giraffe. It happens all the time, I guess, in some parts of the world. Or you get kicked in the head. Probably more likely. Unpleasant results. But what do? Or what if it's a kangaroo stomps on your head? I know, you take him to kangaroo court. The kangaroo, the giraffe, these are not morally accountable entities. We talk about the ethics of animal treatment, but we don't talk about the ethics of animal behavior. We are moral agents who have moral responsibilities towards animals, but they don't engage in morally reprehensible behavior. I don't think my dog ever told a lie. And it's not because he was like this morally impeccable dog among dogs. You know, like super spiritual dog. It's because he was a dog. Dogs don't tell lies. They don't even think them, in my view. But if they did, if these animals were moral agents, you just have the same problem explaining their moral agency that you have explaining ours. Okay. So, but we could talk about different physical objects. How about ants? You know, colonies of ants, they work together and so on. And we talk about them as if there's a kind of sociology of behavior involved in the anthill or the beehive, or in the jungle with chimpanzees. And there may or may not be parallels between human community and some of those communities, but there's a real difference in moral agency on the human level. There's no question about it. We have moral responsibilities. Now here's the question. How do you explain the emergence, in naturalistic evolutionary terms, of moral agents in a strictly physical world? And here's the clincher. What makes our actions right or wrong are moral facts that are not part of the physical world and that are causally inert. Remember, that's one of the things about abstract objects is they don't do anything. They don't cause anything. They don't make things happen. So morality, these moral facts, place human agents, moral agents, if there are moral agents, under moral obligation without causing those agents to exist as morally responsible agents. So our moral responsibility doesn't come from the fact that there are moral facts, except in the sense that that's what it means to be morally responsible. Those facts are related to our moral responsibility in that sense, but they don't explain how there happen to be agents like ourselves. So what is the explanation? And not only that, why would a purely scientific, naturalistic, evolutionary process produce moral objects or entities like ourselves that just so happen to be subject to moral obligation in relation to abstract moral facts? Because evolution doesn't take into account these abstract moral facts. It can't. There's no causal interaction between these physical states that are part of the evolutionary process and these abstract objects called moral facts. So this is a very peculiar outcome, that this naturalistic process would generate objects like ourselves that would come under the obligation of moral facts that are utterly, causally disconnected from the physical world. Now, what if God exists? Well, if God exists, you can make sense of this. Because if God exists, and there are these objective moral facts, no matter how you explain their existence, you can explain our existence by God's intention to create human beings who will have moral responsibilities, because God has a knowledge of these moral facts, and He knows how to bring about an individual whose constitution makes him subject to the obligations of these abstract moral facts. God can bring them together. And I don't know of a better explanation than that. In fact, I don't know of any other explanation. I have only recently been using this argument in public debate. Just a couple of months ago in February, I was debating a philosopher from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She flew out to Los Angeles, and we were hosted by an atheist society called the Center for Inquiry, and we had a debate, does God exist? And in the course of the debate, I presented 4 arguments. One from the origin of the universe, one from apparent design, one from the fact of evil in the world, and one from this argument, from the difficulty of connecting moral facts with human moral agents. And I said, let's take the boulder for example. Let's suppose you're driving your car in the hills, and there's a tremor in the hills, or there's a slight avalanche, and it's caused by whatever, it's natural, and this boulder is dislodged, and it comes rolling down, and the timing is just perfect to ruin your day. And it crushes your vehicle, and you narrowly escape with your life. Okay. Now that boulder is just a physical object. It's just a collection of molecules. You can't blame the boulder for the consequences of the event. On the other hand, if there's a sinister individual, your nemesis, up there in the hill, right, with a stick of dynamite or a long stick, uses that to dislodge the boulder and times it like they used to do in the old westerns so perfectly. Greg Coco and I were talking about this last night. He said, yeah, I remember that in the old westerns. These guys could do that. They could get that thing to just roll with just the right momentum and hit the object at just the right moment. Today it would be like mission impossible. So he gets this rock to roll, and it falls on your car, and you're injured. Now, you don't hold the boulder responsible, but you can hold the agent responsible if you can figure out that he was involved. Now, what's the difference between the human being and the boulder? The human being is morally responsible, the boulder isn't. But Louise Antony, the philosopher that I was debating, believes that both objects are just molecules. There's nothing more to these objects than what they are physically, and that's reducible to molecules. So boulders are collections of molecules, and human beings are collections of molecules. So why this difference between those that are morally responsible and those that are morally indifferent? Neutral. Well, would you like to hear her response? She said, well, Doug, there are all sorts of differences between boulders and human beings. Human beings are sentient creatures. They are intelligent. They have projects and concerns and interests. This is not true of boulders. Now, I know you're waiting for the punchline, but that was her response. There are lots of differences between boulders and human beings. Precisely. So explain the difference. How do you account for the difference? It actually kind of makes sense that you could evolve a boulder. I want to know how you evolve a human being that's so different than a boulder in all the respects that I described, plus the ones that you add. Happily, I'm happy to hear you add. See, that's not, to go on and say, yes, there are differences, is just to concede the point. That's part of my argument. Now I want to know how you explain those differences. And of course, there are people who would say there's nothing to explain because human beings are just molecules, like boulders, we're really not that different than boulders, even though it seems that way to us. But this particular philosopher wasn't willing to go there. She was more sensible than that. She believes in the objective existence of moral facts. And I knew she would, because I did my homework. I read what she had to say, and I knew that she was committed to that premise. And so I said, well, okay then, let's do what we can with that premise. So in response, she said, yes, there are lots of differences between boulders and humans. Now, there are three problems when you get right down to it. The first problem is the problem of explaining moral responsibility. And that's the problem I've been describing so far. But there's another problem, and that's the problem of moral awareness. Not only are we moral agents in an otherwise physically natural world, where our moral actions come under duty and obligation in relation to causally inert moral facts that are abstract objects, but we can know these moral facts as human beings. We can know them to be true. We have knowledge of moral facts. Now, we also have disagreements about what the moral facts are, but there is broad consensus about many of these facts. And the most important point is that human beings do believe that there are moral truths, even when they disagree about what those truths are. And in believing that, there must be some way that they know that, or are justified in believing that. And if they do know any of the particular truths of morality, then there's got to be some way that they know those things or are justified in believing those things. In other words, they have to have consciousness of these abstract truths. Now, how do you do that? How do you explain knowledge of abstract truths? On some naturalistic theories, the way you know things is through causation by the object known. It's called the causal theory of knowing. Very creative name for the theory. So, when you know the existence of a physical object, it's because you perceive the object, and in the act of perception, the object is causing, through a natural process, your awareness of its existence. It's causal. But remember, moral facts are abstract objects, and they're not causal. They can't cause us to be the moral agents we are, and they can't cause us to know the things we know about them. But we know them anyway. So how do you explain that? And then third, to be morally responsible, we have to be free, morally free. Now, there are all sorts of ways that we exercise freedom. I can elect to pick up an object that's sitting here on this lectern, that's not a morally free act, but it's a free act. That by itself is a challenge for naturalism. But you might say, well, but when you pick up an object like that, maybe you're just causally determined. Maybe there's something in your social conditioning, your environment, the reflexes of your physical mechanisms and all that, that ineluctably cause you to pick that object up and to do so more than once. You know, there are C fiber firings going on in your brain. You would describe this as having the intention of illustrating a point, but it's actually just a bunch of stuff happening in your body. And as a consequence of that, through a causal series, your arm reaches down, picks up the object, and so on. It's all determined. No freedom, just the appearance of freedom. Okay. You can't say that about moral action. If you believe that there is such a thing as moral responsibility, there has to be freedom. You can't reduce the perception or impression that we're free to deterministic causal forces leading up to the action. Because if that's all they were, then the act would only appear to be free and would only appear to make you morally responsible. But you're not morally responsible unless you could have done otherwise. And that requires real freedom. Now, how do you explain having that kind of freedom on purely naturalistic terms? There isn't a good explanation for that. But if God is going to constitute human beings so that they live in a physical world but have moral responsibilities in relation to abstract but causally inert objects, moral facts, He's going to have to give them the capacities they need to be morally responsible. And so they're going to have consciousness of morality, a capacity to know moral truths, and they're going to have freedom so that they can be held morally responsible. So you see, this is the problem of explaining in a naturalistic way the connection between abstract moral truths and concrete moral agents. It's a severe problem for naturalism. It's a problem that can be solved if there's a personal God who has intended this arrangement. It's interesting, isn't it, how you get a complementary relation between physical complexity and now something that you can't explain in terms of physical complexity. So last night we heard a wonderful presentation on the evidence for God from complexity at the strictly physical level. And now we have on top of it what's not strictly physical that also must be explained. And the connection between the two. You've got to relate what is non-physical, abstract, non-natural, to what is concrete and physical, albeit complex. I will continue to use this argument as long as the atheist says in response, well, Doug, you're right, there are lots of differences between boulders and moral agents. I want a better response than that. Richard Dawkins has written in his book, The Selfish Gene, we are survival machines. Robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. Me too. He says in the preface to that book, there is a better reason for studying zoology than its possible usefulness and the general likableness of animals. This reason is that we animals are the most complicated and perfectly designed pieces of machinery in the known universe. Put it like that, and it's hard to see why anybody studies anything else. I say put it like that, and it's hard to see why you'd be an atheist. But he is. Of course, the problem is he doesn't understand that you can't do morality zoologically. There is no science of morality. Well, we're out of time. I want to conclude there and recapitulate by noting that there are these two arguments. There's much more about human moral experience that points, I think, to the existence of God. Recently, one of my former students who's now teaching philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University, and I edited a book, it's out on the table, called Being Good. I tell people that when I published my first book called Evil and the Evidence for God, almost 20 years ago, I was just instantly an expert on evil. And I didn't expect that. And people would call me up and say, "Aren't you the evil guy?" Now, that's me. So I thought I learned my lesson and edited with Gary Habermas a book called In Defense of Miracles. So then I became an expert on miracles. And that worked for a while until I showed up to speak on miracles but never performed one. So then I had to do something different. So ultimately, we decided to publish this book, and we titled it Being Good. So I hope now I will become known as the good guy. But it's a book on Christian virtues for everyday life. And recently we've been developing an argument that shows how a Christian account of the virtues takes a better account of all that's involved in the virtues than anything a naturalist can do. So if you take account of the virtue of hope, for example, the Christian can make sense of the virtue of hope in ways that a naturalist cannot, even though naturalists might want to talk about hope as a virtue. But you see, for hope to make sense, there's got to be some realistic expectation of what you hope for to be realized. And yet, it's got to be hope for something that taxes your confidence and your faith and your ability to be sure. And so, hope naturally reaches out towards what seems beyond what's realistic, and yet with some realistic prospect that it will be accomplished. And we are all, as human beings, desirous of something that, apart from God, is absolutely out of the question. I would say, for example, an afterlife. That's better than this life. But if God exists, there's a reason for hope, courage, mercy, compassion. How about this one? Forgiveness. Why forgive? In the real sense of forgiveness. Why love your enemies? If that is a virtue. If God doesn't exist. What does that even mean? And so we've been developing an argument along those lines, and then most recently I've been thinking this thought. When we want to inculcate the virtues, we look to people who have them to give us an idea of what they look like and how to emulate them and to become like that. And Jesus is regarded by many, believers and non-believers alike, as a great moral teacher and a great moral exemplar. A man of considerable virtue. Now here's what strikes me as odd about the person who concedes the point about Jesus, but denies the existence of God. If you respect Jesus and his morality, should you not respect also his own explanation for his view of what makes things right and wrong? His own conception of the virtues and how they are to be exemplified in our lives. I don't think that you take his life and his morality very seriously at all if you don't also buy into his view of the world, which makes sense of that conception of morality. And so I appeal to those who do find the life and the character and the teaching of Jesus morally attractive to begin to reconsider with seriousness the possibility that he was also right about why these moral truths are what they are and how to exemplify them in a world. Jesus was a theist. He believed in God. that explains what is morally admirable about Jesus. I'd like to conclude with a prayer, and then somebody will come up and give us directions about what's coming next. This is called a student's prayer, and it's from the pen of Thomas Aquinas. And if you'll just listen quietly with me as I pray this prayer, I hope it will be your prayer for the balance of this conference through this day. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your light penetrate the darkness of our understanding. Take from us the double darkness in which we've been born, an obscurity of sin and ignorance. Give us a keen understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant us the talent of being exact in our explanations, and the ability to express ourselves with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, the direct progress, and help in the completion. I ask this through Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Thank you.